my name's Elliot. I'm sure you know most of y'all. I'm the co-chair of the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus here at Union. We have the co-chair of the Latinx Caucus, Leslie, who helped organize this event.
Elliot did all the work, so.
Go Elliot! And to my left and right, I have two dear comrades, two dear organizers who really dedicate their lives to the struggle. On my left is Angie from IFCO, Pastors for Peace. And to my right is Mia from NODUTDOL. And so yeah, I'll pass it off to Angie. And actually, before I do, this event is to ignite each other. I think many of us come to Union Theological Seminary because of its legacy of liberation theology, labeling itself as a premier progressive institution. And in some ways, I want to challenge that. In some ways, we have to acknowledge that that's why we're here. And so how can we uplift ourselves? How can we keep ourselves accountable? And what methods can we use? And what organizations are out there that we can join? As well as politically educate ourselves. We know the education system in the United States isn't great, or in most countries aren't great. How can we give an accessible education? How can we educate each other? Because ultimately, that is how many revolutionaries have learned. They learn from their comrades, not only by talking and dialogue, but also doing the work. So I'll pass it off to Angie, who is representing IFCO and Pastors for Peace.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Angie. I did just lose my voice because I came straight from Midtown doing the March for Palestine today. So bear with me as I get through a very important topic, which is sanctions, the blockade on Cuba, and how our faith is deeply tied to fighting sanctions and really holding institutions accountable, all institutions accountable as a part of our faith work, as a part of liberation theology, because it is not separate from the socioeconomic field, right? Your faith has to be put into the work of actually securing the rights of the poor and dispossessed. I know we've said IFCO a couple of times. I'm going to tell you what IFCO stands for, and you're not going to remember, all right? Because no one ever does, but I have faith, right? That maybe you'll learn it, and maybe you'll actually get involved with our work, because it's truly important. Even though we organize with activists and atheists and everyone who has a dedication to the working class struggle, we really call on faith leaders to do the work, to use your platform, to use actually your faith in the work towards liberation for all oppressed peoples. So IFCO stands for the Interreligious, that's not a real word, Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. Right, y'all say it with me. Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. Okay, you're not gonna remember, but y'all said it real good. So it was founded in 1967 by a group of progressive faith leaders and used to direct funds towards U.S. Churches and communities that were actually doing work with people that were trying to do, self-determination work, not trying to live under the oppressive systems that we are subjected to in the U.S. IFCO acted as a bridge between churches and faith communities to organizations that maybe weren't in that lane, but had the same belief, had the same struggle, because all revolutionary work, all work for liberation is faith work, right? You have faith that things will change, that you cannot separate a revolutionary from faith, right? We agree with that? Yeah, y'all know about call and response, right? Because I need your energy up here, because again, this voice, y'all just gonna have to trust it. So, I mean, what does that mean though? Like, what does it actually mean to mobilize faith people to denounce institutions, to demand reparations, right? So when we look at, and I don't want to get the dates wrong, April 1967, right? That's, we're in the middle of the civil rights movement, just to give you some context, because context is very important to what's going on. IFCO organized, along with others, the National Black Economic Development Conference, right, in which the Black Manifesto was presented. Do y'all know what that is? Who knows what the Black Manifesto is? All right, look that up. That's your homework. Everybody write it down. One of the main things that it demanded was for a call for reparations for Black people in the U.S., as many churches, many institutions of faith were actually built on the backs of slavery, right? And as we know, lots of Black churches, spaces in the Bronx, specifically when I came here, I was with the Episcopal Service Corps. My church that I serve there is closing down. And it's because of underfunding from the diocese, right? It's not a lack of money, because I know Trinity Wall Street's got $6 billion, right? So it's not a lack of funds, it's the systemic racism that also exists within institutions, right? Let's name that. Because there's no reason, because if the church is the big C, right? Not your small community that is actually driven towards liberation. I'm talking about big C church, whether it's Episcopal, Lutheran, or any faith institution that has funding and it doesn't go towards the actual poor and dispossessed communities. What is it doing? How is it providing? Right? So the Black Manifesto demanded from white churches and white synagogues that $500 million be paid to support Black companies and institutions. Right? That's quite a demand. It's the right demand, because that money is owed to those people, to those communities that often don't get spaces or funding or activities funded by the church, right? It's always like a charity situation and not an accompaniment. It's not a way in which you actually bring the community into the church to organize itself to fight against poverty, right? And when they organized that, when they demanded that, there was harassment from the FBI, right? As we know, COINTELPRO, huge at the time, harassment by the FBI that actually harassed a lot of the liberation theology churches that were popping off in Brooklyn, all over Harlem, right? That was a suppression of a movement that was actually in line with liberation theology. And I tell you this because I think it's important to our current work with Cuba, right? From that moment, IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation Community Organization, established a principled approach of non-cooperation with the U.S. government, with its illegal and moral laws, right? We don't need to be threatened by laws if we know the work that we are doing is actually good work, right? It's the work that you yourselves as studying faith leaders is called to do, right? And you cannot be intimidated by the U.S. government, because it is in fact our duty to do that work. So let's fast forward from there to 1988 in Nicaragua, right? That is because y'all know about U.S. imperialism, right? You know what it was doing in Latin America? Y'all know about Oscar Romero? Right? Everybody in this room, call and response?
Yes.
All right. Just remember. So we know the imperialism that was pushed in El Salvador, in Colombia, in Nicaragua, right? During the time in 1988, Ronald Reagan was there saying, hey, the Contra are the freedom fighters, right? The Contra were actually backed by the U.S., armed by the U.S., and they had the counter was the Sandinistas, the people who were actually native to Nicaragua, right? So IFCO took upon itself to do a fact-finding mission in Nicaragua to talk about the truth and to bring that information back, right? So they take a caravan down to Nicaragua while they're on a ferry boat. The Contra come by on a boat with guns and shoot the ferry boat. And they end up injuring 29 people, killing 2 people. And my current boss, Gail Walker, and her father, Lucius Walker, who founded IFCO, Pastors for Peace, Lucius Walker Jr., were on the boat, and Lucius Walker was actually shot, right? And while he's laying in the hospital in Nicaragua, he's realizing that the bullet that shot him was funded by his own tax dollars, right? So this isn't obviously not acceptable. This has to be confronted, and that's where the project Pastors for Peace was born, right? So there are more, from that point, there are more caravans down to Nicaragua. We've done things in Honduras, but in 1992, we actually start our work with Cuba with an invitation from a pastor named Raul Suarez, right? And 1992 was good. 1993, however, became a critical point, which formed the relationship that you see today between Cuba and Pastors for Peace. When I say caravan, you cannot imagine what I mean. When I say caravan, we would take school buses, organized school buses, in the name of faith, right? And get them to descend throughout the U.S., pick up people, pick up medical supplies, pick up computers, and organize them all down to go through Mexico without a license, right? Because we don't have to get a license from the U.S. to tell us that it's okay to bring aid to Cuba, who's been subjected to a blockade since 1962, right? And during that time was actually what we call the special period. The Soviet Union was a large supporter of Cuba and in support of the socialist project that is now still in Cuba, right? But when the Soviet Union fell, their access to a lot of things went away because of the blockade that I'll get into, right? And so it's a critical moment. It's a critical moment in which you must determine, right, if you will stand on the right side of history, if you will actually stand against these institutions that are depriving people of their humanity, right? And so they're going through Texas, they're in Laredo, and the bus gets stopped by the Border Patrol, right? And they're like, hey, you're not coming through here. And they're like, yeah, we are, right? You can't stop us, like, we're coming through your bus. Like, no, you're not, right? And then they decided to seize the bus. And they impound it, and Lucius, well, I picked the wrong bus because Lucius Walker was on that one, plus 13 other people, right, who just decided to declare a hunger strike. And they were going to strike until all of the aid was able to make it to Cuba. Now, they go on that strike for 23 days. And if you want to, I don't know, y'all gone like one day without eating, and you're like, this is hard, right? Some of y'all fast for Lent. Imagine 23 days of a hunger strike in order to do the right thing, right? You had to give up your own health to make sure that the Cuban people were provided with things like medicine, right? These are the things that our U.S. government deprives from Cuba. And it wasn't done alone. In fact, they were able to organize demonstrations across the country, because believe it or not, what's happening in Laredo does not become national news. So it actually takes cooperation with other organizers other institutions to make sure that that gets to the media, to have the push for the bus to be freed. If you want to check this out, it's on YouTube. The quality is a little low, so bear with it. It is from 1993, but it's called The Little Yellow School Bus, or Who's Afraid of the Little Yellow School Bus. I also do the social media, so I'll be able to see if the counts went up. And there's about 20 of them. So, no, I'm just kidding. Organize a watch party. And really understand what you can actually do with your faith, right? You shouldn't feel encumbered by it. You shouldn't feel like, oh, I have to say this or I have to say that. Because at the end of the day, the institution is not who you answer to, right? It is your call to humanity. It's whatever higher power that brought you to this journey that you're going to have to answer to. And you have to say that you did the right thing at the right time, right? And that means that we have to be disciplined and organized and really working with the people. So the bus gets released, and the devil's in the house. I won't be stopped. So the bus gets released. Okay, there we go. Fidel Castro, along with the Cuban people, are there to receive those people who were on the Little Yellow School Bus, and you know, this became a critical relationship because they understood that in a space in which you are told you're not allowed to give medicine, you're not allowed to bring computers, old computers, mind you, old computers that the media narrative was that these computers could be used for terrorism, right? And it was like, oh, like ones from the 80s, you can't even imagine how big they are, right? But it's necessary because the blockade that was implemented in 1962 is actually what keeps Cuba from accessing those bare minimum needs, right? A lot of people don't know much about Cuba. Who's been to Cuba? Okay, great. So y'all all need to come on the caravan with us next year. It's next November. We'll try to arrange it with your teachers. Maybe we can bring them too.
Class trip.
Yeah, class trip, school credit. There's things that we can do, right? All things are possible. But when we talk about a blockade, I think it's very important for you to understand what it means. Because I get the honor to go to the UN every year and watch the vote. Okay? The UN, there's the Security Council, and then there's the General Assembly. The General Assembly votes on things, however, the Security Council is the one with the actual authority. When it comes to the blockade on Cuba, I watch country after country from around the world, all of them, get up and say how much Cuba has done for them. That Cuba has provided doctors, medicine, emergency preparedness, right? This small island is literally providing all of that for the world, and they are pleading with the US to stop this inhumane policy. And every year, it's the world versus the US and Israel. And it's been that way for 30 years. The same picture, I watch the same board pop up after continual pleading because the things are getting way worse now. But what really astonishes me is that every year, somehow, the representative for the US has the audacity to stand up and say that the blockade is somehow in the interest of human rights in Cuba. That they are really worried about the human rights of the people in Cuba, and that is why they must continue to deprive them of medicine and food and fuel and basic needs for daily life, right? So I know I might sound like some sort of socialist propaganda machine, which is why I have those QR codes. If everybody could take your phone or take the phone from the person next to you, don't steal it. I mean, just like be with them, y'all are classmates, and scan the QR code. I think it's really understated and important for people to understand that a blockade is an undeclared war on the Cuban people. It bombs their access to medications, the ability to purchase food, and over 80% of the current population has never known a life without the blockade. They have always been under siege and have been forced into resilience. A lot of times we idolize resistance and resilience, and it is heroic and inspirational. But those actions are a force from U.S. imperialism. We cannot get it mixed up. So everyone, did you scan it? Right, you have it on your phone, so that we know that this is free information on your U.S. government website, right? And it's there. And about 10 years from now, they'll release some more documents admitting more terrorism, right? So we see that. First of all, let's note that the Cuban people have never, ever requested intervention by the U.S. government, and in fact, enjoy the right to self-determination. And when you go through it, you see that it says most people, at the time, let's look at the date, the Cuban Revolution happens in 1959. This is called the Mallory Memorandum, which is a reaction to the success of the revolution in Cuba, and more so its socialist agenda, right? Because that is the biggest threat to our system here in the U.S. because Cuba is 90 miles away, right? So if people could actually see a society in which your healthcare is met, your education is met, you have a 100% literacy rate, right? These people are outliving the U.S. population, and they're doing it with no resources. The U.S. has no leg to stand on for why we must live in this constant depravity day to day, right? How many people can't pay their student loans? Call and response, y'all.
Yeah.
All of us, right? You can't. It's hard to pay rent, right? Most of y'all probably got scholarships. You're hoping for one, right? It's important to know that Cuba does the most to provide housing, healthcare, education, all rights for people under the blockade, okay? Under the blockade. But I think as you go through this document, the very important thing for you to see is that last statement. It really reveals the long game of U.S. sanctions, right? So if you ever hear in the news, you'll hear it every 4 years, they'll say the Cubans in Miami, we're fighting for them, but we only fight for them every 4 years. Note that, please. And you'll see what it says. It says the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, right? So the only way to actually make a change for the Cuban government in Cuba is to create hardship, right? Let's break that down because some of those words are a lot. Right? And let's keep on going down, right? Because the last line is really what's important. If such a policy is adopted, aka U.S. sanctions, the blockade, what we see today, it should be a result of a positive decision which will call forth a line of action which, while adroit and inconspicuous. Y'all know what adroit means? I didn't either. It means clever. Right? Clever and inconspicuous, so secretive, right? As clever and secretive as possible makes the greatest inroads in denying money, supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger. Bring about hunger. Starvation is the goal of the U.S. That's what it says, right? Anybody in dispute with that? Call and response? No, okay. And desperation to overthrow the government. So that means the U.S. has to bring about these conditions and then blame Cuba, blame socialism for these conditions, right? Because that's what we hear. Cuba is a failed state, right? But in fact, it's still providing more for its people than the U.S. ever has. And I think it's really, really important that this revolution was fought for by the Cuban people. This is what they wanted, right? Because before Cuba was what we see now, Cuba was a playland for the US. It would be what would be Vegas now, right? And when Fidel and the other revolutionaries came in and kicked out the US, that's a no-no. And even worse, when Fidel came to talk to the president of the US and they said, hey, do you want a line of credit? Fidel said no, right? Because actually loans is a huge way in which US imperialism underdevelops countries around the world. And Fidel knew that, right? He was like, no, actually we're creating an opposite system. And about a couple months later, they're like, not on our watch, right? And still Cuba persists. So,
Who was this document for? Like, was it to the president?
it says it at the top. It's from Mallory to another Secretary of State, yeah.
Okay.
So now that we understand that the U.S. is the lone actor in this terroristic policy, right? We really have to lay out the numbers for you to really understand a sanction, because a sanction sounds harmless, right? It does not give you any sort of like heart reaction, like bomb or grenade or genocide. It makes you think that like, oh, this is just one block to another, right? But from March 2022 to February 2023, the estimated loss for the Cuban economy was $4 trillion. $4,867,000. That's $555,000 an hour. And that means by the time that this event is over, Cuba has lost over $1 million, right? Just in this time that we've been talking about. Over the last 60 years, it's cost $1.3 trillion. And these losses are devastating. And let's remember that Cuba is a small island of 11 million people. That is smaller than New York City. A lot of things are. But it's very, very small, and the U.S. is huge, right? So this small island is still somehow resisting the conditions that are created by the blockade. When we look at the Cuban public health sector, right, I want to highlight the successes of the healthcare system because Cuba actually has the most doctors per capita in the world. The most doctors per capita in the world, right? Because their government is actually dedicated to science and life. And they have education for all. I know here we think that like only one person in 1,000 can become a doctor, right? Because they're so brilliant. But they're real people. And real people, most of you could probably be doctors if you weren't called here. But in Cuba, we understand that actually access to education, having the ability for people to become doctors, is the barrier in our health system. When none of you can get appointments and then your doctor sees you for 10 minutes and looks at your symptoms and says, here's a pill, that is a result of the system we're under. Not because it's actually that hard to be a doctor, right? Not doctors are good, all right? just so we know, I like doctors. But because they have so many doctors, that means that they can have a doctor and a nurse on every block, right? That means the doctor and the nurse come from your community, they know what's going on, right? Y'all remember when the smoke rolled in from Canada, right? It's very important that the doctor is from your block. Otherwise, when you go to the doctor with a cough, they're going to think it's allergies and not the smoke from climate change, right? But we're not going to get into that, not yet. But that's why it's important, because it actually creates trust. This doctor knows what's going on. This doctor sees you at the grocery store. Who lies when they go to the doctor? Just me? Okay.
I don't tell the truth.
That's what I'm saying. The doctor's like, did you exercise? I say, I walked in here, right? Because we're all afraid that if we say what's going on, it's going to be another count against us, that somehow it's going to disqualify us from what little insurance we have, right? In Cuba, when healthcare is actually accessible, that means that you don't have to lie. You can't lie because the doctor will be like, I saw you smoking that cigarette. And you understand that the truth is actually what's going to heal you. Because this doctor's not trying to profit off you. There's not insurance companies coming for your money. They actually want you to live. And that means it's preventative. And because of this preventative system, Cubans outlive the US, right? The Cuban population as a whole has a higher life expectancy than we do in the US. And these successes are due to sheer political will. We have to understand that Cuba centers life at every decision that it makes. The blockade is actually anti-life. The blockade creates difficulties and delays in obtaining essential medicines. And you might say, how? Right? Because I've said that a couple of times. If anything has at least 10% ownership by the US, it cannot be purchased by Cuba. Right? And that includes intellectual property. Right? And if the US finds out that some company somewhere wants to work with Cuba and support the Cuban people, they will buy out that company or threaten that company and say, hey, we're not going to do business with you if you're doing business with them. That's how insidious it is. Just to speed up, because I know I'm running out of time, I think. But we'll get back. Outside of this 10% rule, it also means that trading ships, right? Those ships, if they dock in Cuba, they can't dock in the US for the next 6 months. If they dock in the US, they can't dock in Cuba for the next 6 months. That's an effective year. So you're basically making companies decide between trade with US, who has one of the largest markets in the world, in fact, controls the SWIFT system with US dollar that Cuba's not allowed to use, right? Or trading with a small island that may have saved your population, right? Because if you trade with Cuba, you will be fined millions of dollars. That's the most basic way I can put it. On top of this, Cuba was placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list, same as North Korea, which we'll get to. But that addition to the effects that have already been in place since 1962 means that immediately 60 international financial institutions refuse to work with Cuba. They are not allowed to buy anything on the dual-use item list, right? Which you may not know what that means, but anything that the U.S. determines can be used by the military is dual-use items, right? So that means fertilizers, chlorine, lots of cleaning things. Anything that the U.S. just says, hey, no, because this list is also created and maintained solely by the U.S. There's no one else saying Cuba's a terrorist, only the U.S. And if you do work with Cuba, then you are helping a terrorist nation. And there's absolutely no evidence to support that. And I guess I'll stop there. But that is really the blockade in a very quick and easy, hopefully digestible way for you to understand that, like I said, the rest of the world has been advocating for Cuba, right? Cuba has sent like 605,000 medical servicers, medical personnel, right, around the country, around the world, to 126 different countries over the last 62 years. When there was an earthquake in Nepal, when there was the explosion in Chernobyl, when apartheid in South Africa, when Ebola broke out in Western Africa, Cuba was on the front lines. And they are the absolute example of liberation theology. Because they are sure to center all of the countries that are so it's so what's the word? Evil, but another word. It's so diabolical, right? Diabolical. Insidious. There we go, more words. No. It's so insidious, right? And Cuba leaves no one behind. No one. And it's our work, because the other countries in the world are trying. It's actually the people in the U.S., it's us as the faith leaders to take this as a charge to our government, to say, how dare you deprive liberation for the world? How dare you deprive them of medical help? How dare you deprive them of food and fuel and the right to dignity in life, right? If that's your call, then that's your work. And I'll leave it there.
I know I've just been schooled. Thank you, Angie. The more and more I think about it, we educate each other. And I just want to start a chant, a little call and response. I'm going to say, who protects us? We protect us. Who educates us? We educate us. Who protects us?
We protect us.
Who educates us?
We educate us.
All right. And now we have Mia from NODUTDOL, who will be talking about the Democratic Republic of Korea and what that history has been in relation to U.S. imperialism. And yeah, I think the parallels will prove itself.
Yeah, definitely. One more quick round of applause for Angie, who just delivered 80 years of history in like 25 minutes. So I'm not going to touch too much on the impacts of the blockade in Cuba, just to not be repetitive. But I definitely want to talk about the impact of the same sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known as North Korea. But just to first introduce myself, my name is Mia. I'm a member of NODUTDOL for Korean Community Development. We've been around since 1999 in various forms, mostly concentrated in the New York City area, but now we are expanding across the country, which is fantastic. We are a group of diasporic Koreans who are fighting for reunification of the Korean Peninsula, the right for Koreans to have their own self-determination without the U.S. military occupation in the South, without U.S. interference, and of course sanctions play a huge part in why the relationships between the North and South Korean people are artificially divided and have been since the ceasefire in 1950. So I also want to impart just, I guess, a call to action and just really recognize the moment that we are in. I see some of us wearing our kefias, some of us went to Bryant Park, have been part of the actions over the past month. And this really emphasizes to me how we do have one struggle against imperialism. Like in Palestine, Koreans know what it's like to have a divided and occupied homeland. Cubans know that their suffering over the past 60 years due to the blockade is also due to the same imperialist interests and backed by the same imperialist forces. The U.S. is threatened by a reunified Korea, freedom of occupation. They feel threatened by a free Palestine. They are afraid of a Cuba who is not stifled by the embargo. And this awakening and mobilization that we're seeing over the past month in support of Palestinian liberation is unprecedented in the U.S. And I think it's really our obligation as people who are living in the imperial core to educate ourselves and others, doing things like this tonight, gathering and educating ourselves on the reality of the international struggle. The U.S. is losing their misinformation battle. Mm-hmm. They have an information monopoly controlling 6 transnational media outlets. And the people are understanding the power of this monopoly. They're getting critical of popular media outlets like NPR, CNN, etc., and are taking to the streets and educating themselves. And we need to continue this kind of intellectual battle and continue to informing ourselves in support of sanctioned countries like Cuba and the DPRK, because the same forces that have been misinforming us about Cuba, about Palestine, are also behind the misinformation that is being conveyed about the DPRK. So I kind of would like to kind of humanize the impact of sanctions in a similar way that Angie did with the DPRK. So the purpose of sanctions, right, is to squeeze the people, to crush them with so much, to crush them with the aim that they will feel the pressure and want to overthrow their government, as is in the case with DPRK sanctions. Like in Cuba, sanctions are a tool that artificially creates unmet needs. One of the most devastating sanctions against the DPRK is the ban on items containing metal, used in all major medical, industrial, and agricultural equipment. Even our masks that we wear have metal, right? Simple everyday items. 40% of the population in the North suffers from food insecurity. due to modern agricultural equipment being largely banned because of this metal sanction. You'll see propaganda about how people in North Korea are eating grass, how they're hungry. They are hungry, and it's not because there is a regime who is purposely withholding food and starving. It's because they literally do not have the means, the large-scale agricultural means to farm, and also because of the arbitrarily divided 30th parallel, which separates the North and the South, that the U.S. created. Most of the arable land in the Korean Peninsula is actually in the South. North Korea is largely mountainous. And during the carpet bombing of the North, during the Korean War, where every building that was 3 stories or high, there was not a building higher than 3 stories left in the northern half of Korea. All major irrigation, agricultural land production was carpet bombed. This land was irreversibly scarred. So just a light of, the continued sanctions is already exacerbating a condition that the U.S. has created. In a 2018 report, I don't have access to a more updated one, but in 2018, almost 4,000 people died in North Korea, most of whom were children under the age of 5. We also see a similar pattern in Palestine, where so many of the victims are women and children. These are the people who are most widely impacted by sanctions and by these acts of war, as a result of shortages and delays to UN aid programs because of these sanctions. And undoubtedly, more people have died since that 2018 report. Despite these 73 years of sanctions, though, the DPRK has maintained its sovereignty. It has defied the U.S.'s repeated attempts for invasion and occupation, as they have done in the South. And blockades implicate people across the world, even if you don't live in a sanctioned country. Sanctions are a U.S. imperial tool of control, and they're targeting those, as I mentioned, those who are a threat to U.S. imperial power. And for all people who are in this international struggle for decolonization and for self-determination, blockades are among some of the most powerful weapons that we can defeat. And although Cuba and the U.S. are not at war, sanctions are an act of war itself. Koreans know the reality of living in a never-ending war. We had a ceasefire, which ended the active fighting in the Korean War, but technically, it has not ended. It is just a ceasefire, and that was all the way back in 1950, with no end to the war in sight, with the U.S. occupying the peninsula. So with the U.S. occupying the south of Korea since then, they've been antagonizing the North with these war drills and exercises, and they've actually normalized sanctions as an additional military escalation tactic to further grind their boot onto North Korea's neck, and to keep the homeland divided. Sanctions also are affecting inter-Korean affairs between the North and South. In 2018, the Panmunjom Declaration was signed, in which North and South Korean governments committed to ending the Korean War. However, a few months afterwards, the US-led UN command blocked development of an inter-Korean railway, which was one of the first symbolic steps of reuniting and normalizing relationships between the two Koreas. In 2020, South Korean President Moon Jae-in wanted to develop tourism to North Korea, but the then U.S. ambassador in South Korea blocked this effort, citing that it would be a violation of sanctions because South Koreans might smuggle metal or any of the other various items that is illegal to bring into North Korea. So the U.S. continually meddling, using Korea as its big base, basically, in its pivot to Asia strategy, using the Korean Peninsula as a strategic geographical place in its continued aggression against China, in its quest for its continued domination of Asia Pacific and other strategic places they're going to target. And in order for the Korean homeland to finally have the right to self-determination, for both Northern and Southern Korea to actually have a chance to normalize and have those conversations, we need to demand that sanctions end so that the DPRK can have an incentive and be better positioned to have a better relationship with the South. It's really hard to ask a people to come in good faith to negotiating table, like talk with us when you're actively contributing to the death of the millions of people that live in the North. So that's like one first step of many that's required so that there can be a reunified Korea, but obviously US military interests do not align with that vision. And so ending sanctions and combined with getting the US out of the peninsula implicates all Koreans so that our homeland can be reunited, and implicates all people really, specifically who are living in the Asia-Pacific region. I also want to talk about some of the similarities between the history of Korea and Cuba, of which there are many. Both Korea and Cuba have fought against their colonizers, Cuba doing so in their anti-colonial struggle against Spain in the US, Korea doing so with Japan, and North Korea defying US occupation. And despite US invasion and attempt occupation, their socialist systems prevailed even after the Cold War. To give a little bit of history about the solidarity between the two countries, diplomatic relations were established immediately after the 1959 revolution in Cuba, in which Che visited North Korea and was inspired by the post-war reconstruction and attempts for redevelopment in the North, and cited that as a model for Cuba's development after the revolution. Similar to Cuba, the DPRK has also been on the state sponsors of terrorism list since 1988. There was a brief lift for a point in time, but now they are back on it. And also, the travel ban prevents families from reuniting. NODUTDOL used to organize yearly trips called KEEP, Korea Exposure and Education Program, but in the North. Every year we would send Korean Americans onto a delegation to see for ourselves the reality of what living in North Korea was like. We talked to farmers, we would talk to people just like out in the park, we went into the countryside, went to the city, we talked to workers, people in different unions, and really saw for ourselves and had conversations with people about what life was like there. We had to explain the concept of rent, which was a very humorous because housing was provided for people. And we learned, some of our members, I've not personally gone on this delegation trip, but we've had various report backs, which you can find on NODUTDOL's YouTube, with people sharing their experiences. The travel ban, which was instated in 2017, has prevented us, though, from doing these trips, and obviously it's especially a sore topic for families who have been divided on the peninsula for over 70 years. And again, this is a US imposed travel ban. Similar to Cuba, as I imagine, lots of families have still been separated with the blockade. Cuba, as Angie noted, has been remarkable in its acts of international solidarity, sending vaccines, sending COVID vaccines. The first Latin American country developed their own COVID vaccine, sending them to other sanctioned countries like Iran, Syria. I think Venezuela also received the Cuban vaccine, and sending doctors around the world. Cuba has also been a great ally to North Korea as well, and is trying to circumvent these sanctions through a bartering system. North Korea has been trying to build a railway within their country. There is a metal ban, as I've said multiple times. They're bartering sugar for metal so they can build these things. Bartering is a technicality that they're allowed to circumvent these sanctions. And they have been supporting each other materially through this barter deal since the 60s. And by circumventing these sanctions through these transactions and solidarity with another, they're really defying US imperialism's intent to suffocate them through sanctions and through the US's quest to keep the international community under its boot. The US touts concerns for human rights, as Angie has said, when implementing sanctions, yet the astounding death toll that we see in Cuba, in Korea, in other countries that comes from these sanctions reveals that these humanitarian claims are only a cover story for the US's real agenda, which is continued domination over the global market and resources and unilateral military control and occupation. And for Cuba and Korea, solidarity isn't just a means to keep each respective party afloat and self-sufficient. Solidarity is about showing and proving to the international community that US hegemony can be defeated, that the world does not have to live under U.S. interest and U.S. control, despite these pressing sanctions and other imperial tools.
I just want to add one more thing, right? Because I think we also think of the blockade as like something big between governments and not people to people, but obviously there are travel bans, right? In order to get to, and like travel bans instated by the US. I think that that's really important because sometimes people think that it's instated by North Korea or Cuba, but really those are things that are created and maintained by the US. If you, as a person from the US, want to travel to Cuba, there are 12 travel categories. And for the most part, you have to have an itinerary to kind of prove what you're doing. You're not allowed to stay in 90% of the hotels, right? You're not allowed to use US dollar, as I said, so you have to go and convert your money. And this is a way that really keeps you, as a US citizen who is supposed to be the freest people on the world, on the planet, right? That to keep you from witnessing it yourself, right? If Cuba was truly in such a terrible terroristic state, right? Why would the US ban you? Wouldn't they ban you? Right? So when you must, in every scenario and all information, I don't care if it's here or in your theology class or just out in the world and you're looking at a McDonald's menu, right? You have to ask in whose interest, right? Towards everything. And that will usually tell you the story. Because I think a lot of things get twisted, and when we talk about these sanctions, they're very personal. If you go to your Venmo, right, everybody got Venmo, Cash App, and you say, Cuba, right, Viva Cuba, you use the Cuban flag, it will be shut down. And you have to go through hell with the bank, because no bank transaction is actually fun. But you have to get it unfrozen, say that you're not supporting the Cuban government, when really your friend just wants to send you some money for you to go down to Cuba and get some, extra coffee, right? But they want to make sure that you're not supporting terrorism, but really they're just trying to deprive all funds, even your personal funds, from going to Cuba. And that's the level in which we're at. Right? So I wouldn't recommend trying it, but if you doubt me, please try it. Because I want you to understand the level of these sanctions, of how they operate. It's not out in the world, it's right here, it's very personal, and it's between people and people that should have access to each other. That's what I want.
Oh, thank you. You've been schooled twice. I noticed both of you are wearing keffiyehs, and I hear ceasefire, I hear blockade, I hear imperialism. How do these all connect, and why do y'all care about Palestine from your area of focus in terms of PRK and Cuba? How do those relate?
I think for the Korean people, as I mentioned, 1950, we had a ceasefire too.
I also hear carpet bombing.
Yes,
So.
yep, definitely. History repeating itself for sure. In 1950, we had South Korean forces in the U.S. And you okay?
Yeah.
The Northern and the DPRK had a ceasefire. And it was just, that was it. There was a ceasefire. There was no actual tangible plan to start reunifying, no timeline. And that was obviously on purpose, right? I think why a ceasefire is obviously important right now in regards to the Palestine question, but we also have to demand an end to the occupation in Palestine. Yes, it's important to stop the genocide and demand a ceasefire, yesterday, now. But Palestinians will not truly be liberated unless they are able to get their land back, unless they are given the means to actually live their lives, not being sanctioned, being able to travel freely, and not to live in essentially an open air prison. So a ceasefire, as the Koreans know, is only just a band-aid, a patch solution to end the immediate, not even to end the immediate suffering, because there are people still suffering in the north right now, right? But to also demand and go that extra step to demand true Palestinian liberation through the end of the occupation. So I think that's like a historical lesson that if you saw some of our signs in DC, is that ask Koreans about a ceasefire and how that went. That's why we're especially vocal about ending the occupation in Palestine. And also demanding that Palestinians have the authority and the right to self-determination to make their own calls about how they want to go about reclaiming their land, how they want to construct their government. Because in Korea, the US still has operational control of the military in the south, right? It's not necessarily South Korea's decision to make. The US is meddling through sanctions, through having huge military bases on Korean land, displacing people, polluting. That's a whole other conversation. That is just a very eerie parallel for the Korean people. So that's kind of a conversation that's come up a lot in NODUTDOL a lot, is just how do we demand more than just a ceasefire? Because it's been 73 years, it's been long enough for an actual end to the Korean War, and for some kind of treaty and step to reunification to be made. And Palestinians have also waited way too long for a similar outcome.
I'm going to take this on two different avenues. And I'm going to start with Cuba and Palestine and their relations, right? Cuba does not have a, what's the word? You know, when the ambassador comes.
Embassy?
There is no, I just came from that march, so y'all forgive me. Doesn't have an embassy, does not have relations with Israel, and hasn't, right? And it has been in solidarity with Palestine. That can be highlighted actually through the Latin American School of Medicine that is in Cuba, that trains people from all over the country, all over the world for free, from over 120 different countries, but especially Palestine.
Yes.
Because Cuba recognizes what U.S. imperialism and the $4 billion, the billions and billions of dollars that have gone towards the project of the Israel state for the last 75 years, what that does to an occupied people, and has done the most to try to train doctors to make sure that they are available, even though we know that the bombs that are being dropped on hospitals, right? So, Cuba is going to have to train a lot more, right, after this last month. Cuba's not perfect. And when you come, you'll find out, right? But it is to say, in our solidarity with Cuba, we also look at how Cuba is in solidarity with, again, the world, with the oppressed working class of the world. And we do see that and recognize that. And I think on another note, as people of faith, as that is in our name, right? Say it with me, Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. We ask people of all faith to not stay quiet in the face of a genocide. That's what it is, right? You're killing medics, children, schools, hospitals, thousands, every day. And we can't pretend like there's two sides in a genocide, right? There's not. So when we talk, you should also go to the IFCO Instagram, because I am the communications coordinator. There's a good little graphic about Judaism versus Zionism, right? And that calling out Zionism is not a denouncement of Jewish people or people of Jewish faith, not at all, right? It is a denouncement of the genocide, of the occupation, of the project to continually remove Palestinians from their land, right? So go ahead and read that graphic if you're not on the same page as me, but hopefully you are. And really, make sure that people know that this is not a holy war. I come from Texas.
Word.
Yeah. Yeehaw. Howdy. I come from Texas. And coming to New York, in which there has been a history of liberation theology, is a completely different, structure of faith than what I typically have had access to, right? In which Christian nationalism and the far right has controlled the narrative, especially in the South, but usually in the news, right? And we know that typically, because even though all faiths play a role in morality in this country, the Christian faith often has a say in your rights and the rights of the world, right? So that's why we must call these institutions into order. I don't know if you've looked into your own institution here, right? But there is a letter that Elliot just told me about where teachers are signing on in support of Palestine, and then there's a oppositional letter to that letter, right, where teachers are in support of Israel, right? But this is not about letters. This is about you becoming mobilized, right? How many people have been out there in action for Palestine? Okay, how many people are going to continue to find ways to plug in, right? Because that is your call. In the face of a genocide, you do not want to say, I was worried about being in trouble. I was worried some more people died. This is not an acceptable way to exercise a faith, a living faith that demands we build heaven here. There's no genocide in heaven, right? So we must do our work. I hope not. Really hope not. Right? But when we know that that's what we're called to do, then draw your courage. Pull that call out of you. Pull it to the front. And let your worries about whatever, because history will come back. Right? And you don't want to have to explain to your children, to your whatever, that you sat down as a person of faith, that you sat there and you waited because you were afraid of being chastised. Right? You can't be afraid in a genocide. You must do the work. And that, I think, is the other side to this, because obviously Cuba, but just as people, right? Like I said, all workers, all oppressed people, all poor people, typically, because there are also historical tests, colonialism, and we don't need to go into that. But there is a faith element to your existence. You want things to be better. So you must do the work to make things better. And that's it.
Join an organization.
Yeah, join an organization. Or create, obviously there are organizations that support and put this together, which I couldn't be more gratuitous towards for allowing this talk to happen. But create the organization, build your base, find those people, talk to your people, talk to your friends, talk to strangers, right? Because it's worth it. As I was standing out there today, I got spat on. I blocked it with a sign. Right? But I mean, people are really, I understand wanting to be, because that's what they teach you in our society. Be polite. Don't be political. In fact, do you know how many, because growing up, right, I always asked, I've been in many church spaces, and I always asked my pastors, when I got to an age of consciousness, I was like, do you believe in hell? Right? Do you? And they're like, most of them, all of them, said no. I said, then why do you talk about it? Right? And it's because we know that our institutions have rhetoric that we are supposed to say. Right? But that's a weird cognitive dissonance in your practice.
Yeah.
When you get the mic, say what you want. Right? Do what you have to do to get ordained, but get out there, do the work. Look at IFCO as the example. Look at the many liberation theology projects that grew from Latin America. Look at Cuba, which by the way has full religious freedom, right? Religious freedom looks like walking through the streets and not being hated on, not being worried that somebody's gonna spit on you. Cuba was sure that the liberation theology that was built there was also geared towards the political and socio responsibility towards people. It was not separate. And I don't know, I mean, there's a wave here, like in 1971, of liberation theology really gearing socialist here in the US, but we understand COINTELPRO, as I told you earlier. But how do we build that now? How do we understand that, like, Jesus and most deities that we look at were fighting the empire? He was crucified by Rome, right? I mean, that's saved for a martyr. He's not just like, and because, right? He was saying, hey, this is bad. And they're like, we got to get him, right? That's my interpretation. That's your sermon. But really, when you look at the many parables in the Bible, I'll bring in the bread and the fish, right? Y'all know about the loaves and the fish. And for some reason in Texas, a lot of people think that that's a moment in which Jesus became a magician, right? He was just like pulling loaves out of the air and somehow fed the 5,000, right? But that story is centered around sharing your resources. It said everyone gave up what they had and shared it. And that is the principle in which Cuba lives by, right? You have to pick up a hitchhiker. You give the shirt off your back and have experienced it, right? Which I'm like, no. And they're like, no, we have to, right? Because that is ingrained in their everyday and their way in which they address society. And that's a society we need to build here, where people see a problem and respond. And so you must be those people to be a model, but then also create the basis and organizations in which people are rooted in actually getting their needs met and fulfilling their faith. Because you cannot have a spirit, you cannot be spiritually fed if you don't have a house, if you don't have food, if you don't have health care. If I can't go to the dentist, it's really hard for me to pray with a bad tooth, right? So really think about that. If you are responsible for the spiritual growth of your congregation, your future work, what does that actually look like? And how are we going to do that?
It's a mic drop. I want to, before we open up to questions, I just want to drop a couple more facts and maybe just want to be fact-checked by y'all.
Fact-check.
Isn't it true in 1948 that almost 20 cities were carpet-bombed in Korea?
Yes.
Sounds very much like what's happening today in Gaza. And what we've learned from that is the Democratic People's Republic still exists. They still fight for their people. And if we learn anything from history, those oppressed will continue to fight back and will eventually win. So we are in a moment where each and every day is getting worse and worse. More children, civilians, resistance fighters are being killed. But we must have a revolutionary hope, a revolutionary optimism. Is it true that the US government has countless assaults against Cuba and the assassination attempts?
Yeah, just over 4,000.
Yeah. Yet Cuba still exists and has a higher life expectancy than the life expectancy of the United States. So we're not just saying these things out of a virtuous kind of rah-rah idea. we have to look back to history. We have to look at the material conditions. Where are we now? What history tells us? And obviously there is a disconnect in some ways, because the now is not like 2 days ago, the now is not like a month ago, the now is not like 30 years ago, but what can we learn from history and how we implement it? I also know that there's so much propaganda about Cuba, about North Korea, and like Mia said, we know, like, we're waking up to all this information. You know, we're waking up to all the propaganda that we've been fed. We're questioning the New York Times narrative of Gaza. We're questioning CNN. We're questioning Fox across the board. And so I just want to offer that up. If you have some questions for these two lovely comrades, this is your time. Anyone have questions?
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate all that you have to say. I think I've already been aware of a lot of the sanctioned violence that the U.S. does, but specifically when it comes to DPRK, I feel like I'm approaching this topic from step -5, because I have only known the propaganda.
Yeah.
And so I guess I do not in any way conflate Korean people with their leadership, but I only know in terms of like hateful leaders that we should not be supporting, things like that. So how does your organization have those conversations when it comes to not being so distracted by like these charismatic figures that we've only learned through propaganda?
Just to clarify, are you asking like how NODUTDOL like defies like mainstream like propaganda narratives, or like?
Well, I'll give more of a like specific example. I know like even earlier this week in my class we were talking about like Juche ideology and how like Kim Jong-un is like, and I only know him as this terrible figure.
Yeah.
And so that is the reason of like a lot of mistreatment of people. I know that's not be 100% true, especially in all the smear campaigns that happened in Cuba. But I guess how do you navigate those types of counter arguments?
Right. I think the first thing I'll say is that the U.S. And Western imperialist forces have banked on people seeing North Korea as unknowable. It's untouchable, it's the hermit kingdom, you can't know anything about them. But reality is that it's imposed through things like the travel ban, through lack of communication, because people in the North do not have the material means to actually share their everyday lives with people because of Western imperial control over the media. They don't want you to see what everyday life actually is in the North. I think when it comes to things like dismantling narratives around leadership, I think it's important to know about the historical context of the North and how people kind of view the Kim dynasty. Is that Kim Il-sung liberated Korea from hundreds of years of Japanese occupation. He trained thousands of battalions. He was a huge historical figure, North and South, who was widely lauded as helping Koreans defeat themselves, protect themselves from U.S. invasion to keep their sovereignty. That was throughout the peninsula. And to this day, I think the people in North Korea see his legacy as something that should be protected, especially now more than ever when you have all these outside forces, again, history repeating itself, doing antagonistic war drills at the border. When you're literally one of the most persecuted and sanctioned countries and isolated countries by the US imperial power. So of course they're going to support leadership and people who have been able to keep them alive through this juche, which for people who aren't familiar with the ideology, just to give like a quick TLDR, is just this tenet of self-reliance. There's a thing called juche steel, which is Korean-made steel. As I mentioned, there's a metal ban in North Korea. So things like creating work plans to boost the economy, to steer a people out of horrible famine in the 90s, and still trying to create kind of an infrastructure. That has been something that the Korean people have elected time and time again. Most people in North Korea are part of the Workers' Party of Korea. They do have elections, they do have local councils that they elect. But throughout the course of their 60 years of existence, it really has been the Workers' Party and that leadership that stemmed from Kim Il-sung that people really do respect, and do see him as kind of someone who has like saved them and protected them since Japanese occupation, and has also protected them from uncertainty when there's US antagonism and this repeated threat again. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
And I think I try to add, like,
Yeah.
if we
That texture.
think about juche ideology, translations, self-reliance or subjectivity is also one.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And the irony of like American propaganda is they will twist self-reliance in this way that is extremely individualistic, and go, you know, we're like, oh, individualism is bad. But juche is not about individualism. It is very much communal, and it is, if we're good leftists, we'll look at this at a materialist lens. What brings about this idea of self-reliance? And I think Mia alluded to blockade, sanctions. How can we keep our dignity and be proud? Oh, you're going to put the conditions of we do have to self-rely. But yeah, oh yeah, we are going to self-rely. Look how resilient we are. And I think the point that Angie made about self-reliance or resilience is forced by the conditions of sanctions, of imperialism. And so how can, it's that tension of I'm going to have dignity for myself and be proud of my nationality in the face of imperialism. All that also goes about with nationalism. There is a strong, we see the global South having such strong nationalism, being proud of their country fighting back against imperialism. And that is a strategic nationalism, not the nationalism that we see in the United States, because we happen to be the oppressor, there's nothing really to be proud about. But to harken back to the resilience, to harken back of our people are strong despite what the US imperialism system tells us. So we have to, I think looking at it materially, how did juche form? And is it really all bad? Because yeah, you said most of the workers are in the Workers' Party. It is a strong testament to what unified, democratized workspaces look like.
So I have two questions. Thank y'all again for explaining and laying out a lot of kind of what I got the theme was is trying to resist against like sanctions and resisting against that chokehold that U.S. imperialism has is like a big snake that wraps around all the oceans. So two questions I have. Well, one particularly, do you know of any like media or news source or connections? Well, particularly with regarding to give insight about resistance efforts that have been based in either Cuba and Korea, and kind of giving like that, or also like kind of correcting like narratives, you know, to get more of a real story. And the second question I was wondering about is, I wonder in the particular context, I guess, speaking as someone that is like, African American, and it's something that, and I know that, and it's becoming my understanding of, not just white supremacy that we know it of America, particularly in implementing like a racial caste, but also operates in a global systemic sphere that operates with white supremacy kind of at its like core, and and perpetuates that like kind of continuously. So I wonder like kind of what has the effort been within like both the context of Korea and Cuba in trying to undo white supremacy? I like that ideology within it. And I wonder how that struggle has been.
Okay, I can take that for Cuba. News sources, like when you say resistance efforts, you mean just like living? Or, like, because that's, like, they're resisting the US, right? So.
Well, yeah, that's one part of it. I was also thinking, like, if there's any, I don't know, like, what other, like, maybe not in that context. I mean, maybe if living kind of is the one that kind of sustains itself the most, then that probably, like, makes sense. If there's particularly anyone that's, like, antagonistic towards the U.S. military, and they're like, sanctions and embargo, and
within Cuba.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really know how to answer that question because I don't quite understand it. I mean, I think Cuba's existence is the resistance. The willingness of Cuban people to debate and continue to exist and protect their space and figure out how to get through the global isolation placed on them is the resistance effort within Cuba. Cuba's model is based on solidarity, which is the opposite of imperialism, right? So I would say that is probably the biggest model of resistance to U.S. imperialism is the solidaritist model. They are a beacon of South-to-South cooperation. They, like what was said, they send doctors, vaccines, any sort of help around the world. And as far as news sources, there's Resumen, which is a great one. There's Belly of the Beast Cuba, right? Belly of the Beast Cuba is a great short documentary episodes. There's like many episodes in which it addresses a lot of what I said here, but like live on the island, and you can hear it from Cuban people and really get a sense of what Cuban life is like. And then there's also Breakthrough News, which is another good outlet. There's lots out there.
Out there, Blowback podcast?
Yeah, Blowback podcast is also, if you're a podcast person. Also, if you give me your email, one of the things that we do at IFCO is create the Cuba News, Cuba Buzz, and I send out every week different articles to talk about what's going on in Cuba, what's new. Like there's a new medical cooperation between Virginia Commonwealth University and a man named Dr. Wynn, which means that they had to like navigate all the blockades to have that exchange. But the advancements in Cuba are astounding. They have a lung cancer vaccine to treat stage 3, stage 4 lung cancer. They have a treatment for diabetic ulcers. There's all sorts of things that we are kept from, right? I bet everyone in this room knows someone with diabetes, right? And that kind of treatment can actually save your life, not just your leg, right? Because we know after someone has their leg amputated, like 80% of those people die within the next 5 years. So, I mean, these are the things that you need to know that, like, are tangible things to fight for, right? We need access to Herbadop, which is the name of the treatment, right? We need access to Cinemax. We need to be able to exchange these advancements because our society is lagging, because there's tons even a treatment for Alzheimer's that's being developed. So I mean, it's very important to get the right sources. Those are the ones I recommend, but I also recommend going to the IFCO website, being like, I want to keep a buzz. And also getting involved, come on a caravan. When you go to a country, don't just go as a tourist. Go with a brigade. Go with the intention of learning about that country. And if you come either with us, or there's one led by the National Network on Cuba, and another one by the name of the Vincent Ramos Brigade, you will go and learn about all the different sectors in Cuba. And I really think that that is a transformational thing. You will really understand liberation when you get to Cuba. Mainly because your phone won't be on, and you will actually have to think for the first time. But really, you don't understand what it means to walk through streets and for people to smile at you, for people to be anticipating your needs before you do. That's the kind of society you need to know and like form and validate and have it never ripped from you, so that you can't look at an issue and be hopeless. Cuba is the reason I have such resilience and optimism towards everything, because I know it is actually possible. So I would say go towards those sources, but get there and make it happen, and talk to your teacher that was here, and make the institutions pay for it, because you should be learning something to take with you, right?
Also,
not that I'm demeaning you're probably actually learning really great things. I love James Scott. All right.
I think on top of that, just like the technological innovations, in some ways is a resistance to the capitalist forces. We're taught like capitalism breeds innovation. Even here in this country, I think most of the technology in your phone was fundamentally funded by the government. And Cuba, with all its innovations, is a beacon of light. Most innovation does come communally through cooperation.
I would also like to state, like, capitalism only creates copycats and like products that you don't want, right? Like, how many times have you bought something and it because you're poor, and it breaks in 2 days, right? That should be against the law. You should not be able to buy low quality products. If I get one more flavor of Fanta, I'm really gonna lose it, right? Is that innovation? No. In fact, innovation is a tool of the poor, because you're forced into thinking, what are we supposed to do? A lot of people romanticize the cars in Cuba, right? Being like, oh, they're stuck in the 50s. No, that's when the revolution happened. That's when the blockade happened, more importantly. And that's when access to things such as cars became very, very difficult. Those cars are still running, and not because they got the parts from Ford, right? But because they literally have to figure it out. Because they have a limited quantity and it needs to run for people to get around. So that's what they do, right? I don't even know what
I think there's a question about
innovation.
Is there racism?
Let's talk about racism in Cuba. First of all, right, we must address systemic racism, right? In the way in which a capitalist system maintains certain minorities, black and brown people, into the lower ends of wealth, right? We know that that's a product of our capitalist system. When you look at the Cuban system, it's not capitalist, it's a socialist system. So that means that education, healthcare, all the basic needs, housing, is accessible, right? So that kind of flips the idea of racism as we understand it here on its head, right? And material need. Now, that being said, we do have to talk about what is left over from colonialism, right? So even though Cuba has kicked out the colonizer, it was kicked out in 1959. That's recent history, right? We've had 200 years here, and we're not even one step closer. If anything, we might be backwards, right, here in the U.S. In Cuba, they have an approach to address the leftover feelings of racism between the white Cubans and Afro-Cubans, and it's through education, in which it was implemented in 2019, and really teaching the teachers to teach the students about racism, right? It's addressed at an educational level, because the system is already there, right? Now there will be like wealth gaps because of remittances and because of like people who are in Miami sending money back, right? But not in a systemic level, right? These are like individual issues, but that does mean that typically white Cubans might have more access to wealth overall, because those are the people who were kicked out of Cuba, right? But as far as an approach, they acknowledge it, they deal with it, they talk about it, and they're implementing an education system towards it. Where here in the US, you have critical race theory being suggested, and they're like, get that out of here, right? So when we look at like the vast difference, that's really what I mean by like you have to go witness it, because it's so hard for us to wrap our minds around a society that holds itself accountable.
That kind of reminds me of maybe bringing up the family code and how education was extremely important.
I love the Families Code.
Talk about what that was.
Yeah, let's talk about the Families Code. Because one of the major faults that the U.S. claims Cuba has is a lack of democracy, right? Because I don't know if y'all know, but we're in a very democratic system here. Y'all feel that way?
Right.
Yeah. There we go. Here's the call and response. That's all I have to say. Y'all are feeling the burn from election day, right? Y'all are like, what are we doing? Because here we wake up and our rights were taken from us in the night, right? They were leaked out. And then all you have is a response system. You don't have anything that's actually built from the voices of people, because there's not actually people there to represent the needs of the working class, right? They use identity politics to make you feel like Kamala Harris, because I'm Indian and she's part Indian, and somehow she represents me. We have nothing in common, in fact, right? And that's just not how it works. You need people who actually come from your society, your struggle, to be interested in fixing those struggles. So in Cuba, they have a thing called the Families Code. This is like a constitution, right? In which it addresses the way in which people should behave, what is actually legal and illegal, and why these things need to be implemented. They just voted in September of 2021, right, on a Families Code that was drafted for 3 years. Now, some of you might be like, that's a long time. But let me tell you why, right? Because here, we don't even see legislation. I have never read a bill in my life, right? I just know the end line and say I agree or I don't agree. And it doesn't really matter because my representative is going to vote. In Cuba, they decided they were going to redraft the Families Code, and they held thousands of town halls around the island. This was also able to be addressed because they have a thing called CDRs, the Committees in Defense of the Revolution. Don't let that scare you, right? It's just a way in which the blocks are organized, in which people know who lives in your neighborhood. They can address things like hurricanes. That's a whole nother level. We won't go there, but it's amazing. But because of these systems, like they're also able to do things like voting and town halls, and you have actual discussion, right? So a draft would come forward, people would discuss and say, I hate that, I love this, I hate that. They would take notes, submit all of those, and then they would come up with a new draft, and this kept going for 3 years until they believed they had a draft that would be approved by a majority of the Cuban people. Right? That is a democracy. That is actually a law or a bill or a constitution that represents the desires and the voices of the people in your society. I need to also note, after those 3 years, they finally voted on it. They had polling stations across the country, and their voter turnout was 76%.
Wow.
Y'all are saying, wow, but that's extremely low for Cuba. And it was only low because they were evacuating for a hurricane. So in a hurricane, 76% 76% of the population was able to go and vote. And why? Because their voice was represented. They wanted to make sure it got passed.
It passed.
It passed and addressed things like gay marriage, queer adoption, rights of trans folks, maternity leave extended for 2 years, maternity leave being extended to the actual figure that is taking care of the child, right? Not just to mothers or fathers or a caring figure, right? It addressed rights of children, rights of the elderly. So many things that I also have an English version if you want to read it. But it's so many things that we can't even think to put into our laws, right? So that is a society that like really gives you an example of what democracy means, what it is to have an entire island say, hey, you know what? Like, humanity is super important. We got to make sure that we codify that, right?
And so it's like, it's healthy debate. What we have here is, we debate people that we don't even like.
Yeah.
You know, we're like, yeah, I like this person more than this person. And
Not even.
We educate each other.
Oh, and
We teach each other.
let's talk about that too, right? Because y'all might be like, oh, well, they have elected officials, blah, blah, blah. No, because I was able to watch a vote in Cuba. It was super cool. They also involve children to go and guard the ballot box, right? Super cute. They're there. But they understand their role and how important it is to vote, right? How many of your friends don't even vote, right? A lot. So from the time you're a child, you're like, this is my duty. Then they elect people from within their own communities. And there's no like big banners and paid for smear campaigns. It is like 3 resumes on a wall in black and white with a little picture. It tells you what they did. That you probably don't even have to read because they come from your own society. That is what an election looks like. That's a representative body to actually be interested in your needs and your struggles.
I think we'll take one more question. There we go.
I feel like I'm still wrestling with this question because, and I think it just points to like how, I don't know, I think we don't actually understand as people who've grown up in the U.S. like what liberation actually looks and feels like. I mean, it was interesting. A friend and neighbor here was saying like she has a different relationship to her body when she's in Cuba because she's not bombarded by advertisements with like women's bodies all the time, and how like liberating that was. So I mean, thinking about like the U.S. war machine, U.S. imperialism, that's like the one piece that I feel so overwhelmed by, because like they have the guns and like, you know, and then my mind goes like escalatory tactics, like what is actually effective, like but I think what I'm hearing tonight is just like a reframing of like, you know, maybe it's not just about the escalatory tactics. It's like digging deeper and actually experiencing like what liberation like looks and feels like, and having like a personal relationship with that. And I am wondering, you know, like how we can use our own bodies and privileges as U.S. citizens in opposing U.S. empire directly. So just curious what you have to say in terms of like, I don't want to go to immediately, what are the organizational tactics and strategies that we can implement? And I am wondering about, our positionality and how we can use that.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 things, right? Like, make a ruckus. Like, be loud. All these people in the streets are really changing the narrative. A lot of people like to denounce protest and say, oh, then they just go home. Well, they're not going home. And globally, they're not going home, right? How do we create that kind of shift around the depravity in Cuba, right? I think first it starts with education, then it starts with organizing. Or you can do both at the same time. But get into an organization and really like understand that Cuba has been able to battle sanctions and resist because of how well it's organized. It's not a magic trick. Like they are literally organized down to every block. if we can organize ourselves and organize our own communities around our needs, like that will in its own way start to absolve some of the oppressions we encounter here in the U.S. Right, and then we can't. We have to start to think about how our own oppression is linked to global oppression because they're not separate, right? And really, get the political education that's required to start that analysis and really put that into all pieces of your work. And I think, like, I use every platform. I'm talking about Cuba all day long, on the subway. On the subway, I was actually like talking to this woman from Germany, and everything is relatable to Cuba, right? So we start going back and forth about Cuba. She's like, oh, that Fidel Castro. I'm like, oh, really? I think he might be a great guy. And we're really just like going, but I'm approachable. And like we're having this discussion, and she's like, I didn't know. And really practice that talk, practice being able to explain on very simple terms what imperialism is, what is systematic oppression, how is that linked to our institutions, including our faith institutions, and really, if we can't like share our information, then you're just a library, right? Like you have to be able to actually use every space. Because as I'm having this conversation publicly on the subway, as I get off, this guy's like, hey, how do I go to Cuba with you? Right? And this is a practice. It's a real thing. People want to know. They just don't, like you said, have the resources. They don't know where to go. So we have to direct people there. We have to do that. And the best way is through organizing, because when you have many people to fight one thing, it becomes very easy. Many hands make light work, as they say.
I think the only thing I would add to that is when you're asking how do I use my body and how can I best show up in this moment living in the imperial core, is don't let yourself fall into this despair of this cycle of agitation. There's always going to be something, a new current event, a new tragedy, a new historical world event that's going to happen where people are going to be really hyper-focused and down and like just in despair. And that's what the US imperialist power wants you to feel alone and as an individual. And maybe next election cycle you could vote for somebody who's going to change the condition. But that's not how it works, obviously. I was somebody who was really invested in electoral politics years ago and thought that was how I was going to vote my way out of imperialism, which was obviously BS. The best thing you can do, the theme one call to action, is join an organization. October 7th, when Palestine first broke through that fence and there was the retaliation by Israel, yes, I felt despair about the objective situation in the moment, but I also felt empowered knowing that I had an organization that I could go back to, like, all right, how are we going to respond? How are we going to mobilize? Because I already had that community and I had that framework where I didn't feel so alone. There's this great quote from Grace Lee Boggs where she talks about this agitation cycle and how you can't just be agitated for a second, because that's only about mobilizing. What people are doing right now is mobilizing in like one-off instances, but like in the past, but right now what we're seeing is a movement. Things are building off each other. People are showing up multiple times a week at 3 p.m. on a Thursday and actually making a movement and continue to organize. So that's really the best thing I can recommend for anyone is truly join an organization, study, read, build relationships with people, and you will not feel so alone. You will feel optimism. I've seen a lot of people on social media being like, what do? I feel alone. But when you're in an organization, you feel empowered, you have the tools, you know who to talk to, you know there's a greater plan because you're with a group and you're working as a collective. And that's what gives you revolutionary optimism and really defeating that cycle of just feeling down and not empowered. So
yeah, I think when you like, yeah, you know that like feeling you get from your community, probably your church community, your faith. Like, how many people grew up in church? Yeah, I did too, right? And that feeling that you get when you walk in and you're like, these are my people, right? That same feeling is what happens in organizations where you're like, these people have my back. And it's a place for when you meet the person who's agitated and doesn't know where to go, for you to say, come join me. We have a plan.
Yep.
And that's really, in these moments, in these pivotal moments, like when we see the outcry, we have to be able to take those people and say, don't worry, we're going to keep going, and give them tasks, right? Because a lot of times you rise up and they say, oh, I have to go to work, I have to do all these things, which is true. But you must get into the mentality of making time to organize. All that time that you spend worrying can be shifted and transformed into organizing. And yeah, find the right one for you, right? Like, try it. If it doesn't work, go to a different one. Figure out what you believe and get that education in. I'm gonna plug the People's Forum because I love it. Shout out to the People's Forum. They actually have a class right now on Caribbean Revolution. They have a class on revolutionary feminism, and many classes in which, like, it's for you to read and discuss and think about what you think, right? A lot of us are reading things and we have nobody to talk to. It's very important to have that exchange and to form your own consciousness and to figure out how you're going to respond, because we need all responses, good responses that center humanity.
Also, I think the real another benefit of an organization is you're not swayed by these moments. You had a position prior to October 7th, and you're not gaslit. You're not gaslit by media and social media where people are like, no, you gotta think this way, you gotta think this way. You're principled. You're disciplined. And being gaslit is so much despair. It's so overwhelming. But having like comrades, a community, an organization that would like, now like we're not reactionary. We had a stance before anything that happened.
Yeah, having a grounding in your reality will really transform your despair. To really understand that you are not the reason you're suffering. That'll change your life, because then you understand you have to fight, right? You're not going to try to shift yourself into whatever will make you successful, because the system is not working in a way to make you successful. And once you acknowledge that, you can start to work towards dismantling that system, because people deserve access, including you. You are a successful person, and you will do it, but you have to organize.
But you have to organize.
You have to organize.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue into what organizations can people be plugged into?
I mean, I want everyone in this room to come to Cuba with IFCO. Straight up. I think if you have the time, if you don't have the time, make it. What do we do?
When do you go?
When do we go? Next November 2024. We'll be going to Cuba. The exact dates are not determined yet, but that's when we'll go. If you want to go to May Day, which is the largest celebration of workers in the world, it's usually in Cuba. It's very empowering, because everybody comes out and they're like, we did this, and you're like, yeah. And you actually get to stay at a camp with people from around the world and learn from them what Cuba means to their own liberation, which is, again, astounding. That happens, of course, May 1st. And then Viceremus Brigade, I can't remember when theirs is, but
Code Pink goes on May Day.
yeah. So yeah, just get there. But yeah, IFCO is a great one to plug for.
Do you have a preferred organization?
It's really hard. NODUTDOL, if you're Korean. If you're not Korean, you can still apply to join if you're really passionate about the right to self-determination and getting the U.S. out of Korea. I also would say, like, you're probably you might want to shop around a bit. Sometimes not all organizations are a great fit, and that's totally okay. It can take you a year or two to find the one that's best for you. I know that Freedom Road Socialist Organization is popular. It's more labor-oriented. Obviously, PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, is like the largest organization, I would say, in the US. And they have chapters, including a active one in New York City. They have events all the time. I think that's like a very good, like, general organization for people to start orienting themselves. It's a good way for you to meet other organizations. I think right now, also, like, if you're really moved by the struggle for Palestinian liberation, check out Within Our Lifetime or Palestinian Youth Movement are also great organizations to check out. I wish I had more off the top of my head, but those are like kind of the ones that are coming to mind right now.
Yeah, I think Code Pink is a great one.
Code Pink is, yeah.
Answer Coalition.
There's tons.
Yeah, there's tons.
There's tons, but like go to Actions, talk to the organizers, introduce yourselves, build relationships, and just talk. Yeah.
And the more events you go to at the People's Forum,
Yeah.
literally every organization goes through there.
You'll go.
Go.
I'm connected with Dare to Struggle, and they primarily do a lot of advocacy around, I guess, like police repression, NYCHA, privatized housing, neglect, and they do a lot of kind of what you describe as like direct outreach and going and talking to people and trying to get insight about ways that they can, what ways they figure would be useful for like liberation, and basically trying to undergird from those that are suffering under this belly of the beast the most, and that is like the most oppressed in our communities. And that's kind of their orientation. That's another organization I'm connected with in New York. So
Which organization?
Dare to Struggle.
Actually, another one, Brooklyn Eviction Defense is recently has really been elevating their political line. They started out as an eviction defense organization working with different tenant unions, but that's one that is becoming more internationalist and anti-imperialist in its struggle. I believe Crown Heights Tenant Union as well. And it really shows.
You have to live in that area.
Yeah, you have to live in these areas, but it really shows how these struggles are connected. Why isn't a tenants union talking about Palestine? And so, yeah, I guess hopefully that's enough organizations that we've listed off.
I'm just in an internet relationship with them, but 18 Million Rising, I feel like they have, great, the stuff they're putting out is great, and it's all about solidarity.
So like, we can build a faith contingent here, right? To do work. So,
Well, what's IFCO stand for?
get out of here. $5 to anyone who can actually say it. No, not you.
We have Steph.
I'm curious what you guys' take is on what does a socialist project look like in the 21st century, and what, based on what we've seen in like the 19th and 20th century, what can be learned from that, and like what does the future of it look like locally and then also like globally?
I mean, I think the Socialist Project looks like Cuba in the 21st century.
Yes, there are successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it just, socialism in and of itself is about meeting the needs of people, plainly. So, yeah, I mean, I think Cuba is what it looks like. I don't really,
I'd recommend the book Socialist Reconstruction.
yeah, that's a great book.
And that book is not an end-all be-all. The intention, actually Cornel West wrote the, forward? Or something like that. But it's
And it was
not-
published in 2021.
Yeah, it's
So
very recent.
understand that a lot of things
Yeah.
have happened in the last 2 years.
And so there's many sections on different ways of going about it, but I think there's also enough humility by the writers stating that we know for sure this is definitely not how it's going to happen, because to have it in one book would really be arrogant to
Yeah,
say.
it's just like a recipe.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But like, there are many ways to make spaghetti. I don't even like spaghetti, but there are many ways to do it.
Nice.
And yeah, it's just talking about like how can you use the current structures now, like Zillow, right? Where it knows all the housing, right? Like when we talk about homelessness issue, it's not a homelessness issue, right? There are vacant apartments. So really it puts those things in connection. It also explains neocolonialism. It really like lays out all the issues and what we can do. And again, it's just a recipe, but it's a good place to start.
It's a good recommendation, yeah.
All right,
All
thank
right,
you so
should we
much.
call it? Yeah.
Thank you so much.